Welcome back to Dr. Supercoach YouTube for Pigs Round 4 Captaincy recommendations. Last week was interesting. There were some big scores in there. Luke Jackson's massive 165, Jack Sinclair's 162. That was actually my pod recommendation, so if anyone got on that, they would be loving life. Otherwise, it was a bit disappointing from some of them. I think there was still plenty of, 130s like the Tom de Konings and the Zorkos, those kind of guys of the world. So hopefully you are able to get yourself a decent captaincy last week. Last week I did do the Tom de Koning VC. That worked out, pretty well for me. It was looking like a 140, got scaled down to a 133, but can't help that. That's all good. I'll still take that. So now, looking ahead to round 4, there are two teams again on the bye. There's Bombers and the Hawks, so hopefully you've got a loophole. You might have a Kako or a Zach Reed or a Jackson Pryor or maybe even a Will Day, something like that. So hopefully you've got a loophole and you can have a crack at a big VC. And I'm about to tell you who those big VCs are. My number 3 option is Baslenka. Bailey kicked off his season with games of 32 disposals and then 25 disposals last week in a pretty tough matchup in the rain against Brisbane. So that was still pretty solid, and this week he gets the second easiest midfield matchup in the game. The Demons are looking below average this year, and they've just given up some big scores to inside midfielders. Granted, Baz isn't a big CBA guy, but that's okay, because Melbourne are also the second easiest matchup for wingers and attacking defenders. Baz's hard-running and accumulation game, I think it could lead to another spike score this week against Melbourne, who, I watched them last week, they were horrible. I think if you own Max Holmes as well, he could reward you this week. I like both of these guys. I was tossing up whether I recommended Baz or Max in this spot. I decided on recommending Baz just due to, I think he's got a higher ceiling, really. If you're someone who likes to try for two safe 120s, I think Max Holmes could be a great option here if you own him. But I think all Baz Smith non-owners should be looking to trade him in this week. He's on the bubble. The matchup doesn't get any better than this. I think this is going to be a pretty big one. Then in the same game, my number 2 VC is Max Gawn. And look, this is a very pivotal week for Max Gawn owners. We know he started the year with an easy round 1 matchup, which he scored fine. He probably didn't go as big as owners wanted, but he still did well. Then 2 hard matchups in which he's really struggled, and he looked pretty average. He now enters a run of very, very easy matchups. So this is why you started him. This run coming up. He has looked bad the last 2 weeks, but if he's ever going to bounce back, it just has to be this week against the Cats. This is a team that's been running Sam de Koning and Blitzards in the ruck recently. They've been the second easiest matchup for ruckman in the last 10 games. They have been giving it up. And even if Geelong bring in Reece Stanley, which some people are saying, well, I don't really care. Stanley isn't restrictive, and he shouldn't impact Max Gawn if Gawn's on top of his game. So that's the thing. If Gawn is on top of his game, this should be a monster. If he struggles in this one, I think the writing's on the wall that you're like, wow, something's really not right. So we know Gawn dominates when he's able to win the hit-out battle and when he's able to grab the ball out of the ruck for contested possessions. So that's exactly what SDK gives up in bulk. I remember in the preseason, I looked ahead and I kind of looked at the first 5 rounds of captaincy options, and I was expecting this matchup, Max versus SDK, to be the highest scorer in round 4 and one of the highest scorers of the first 5 rounds. So this is one that I would have been targeting if I was a Max owner. But, given Max's form, Melbourne's form slump, I'm not confident anymore that it's the highest score in the round, but as a vice captaincy, I think it's a perfect high upside VC. This is a player that's done 200 Supercoach before, and now he's playing a very, very easy opponent. I think it's now or never for Gawn in Supercoach 2025. And if you're an owner, I think you just go with the VC on him and hope that he is who you think he is and who you paid for. If he doesn't, I know there's other questions that we need to have, but if you own him, this is the week to VC and hope he turns it around. Unless you own Dane Zorko. This is now the guy who I think could be the highest scorer of the round because he is on fire. One of the best picks of the season, and it's only going to get better this week. Coming into round 4 with scores of 139, 136 and 135. He now comes up against Richmond, who are the second easiest matchup for opposition designated kickers. the easiest matchup for general defenders, and the third easiest matchup for attacking defenders. That's saucy. Zorko has only played against Richmond once in the last 2 seasons. That was last year, and he ripped off a 161 against them. That very well could be on the cards again this week. This is a team that just allowed Jack Sinclair to run around undefended last week for 162. Do you remember last year that Luke Ryan 197? And also that James Sicily 147? They were against Richmond. This is a simple equation. The highest averaging player in the league against one of the leakiest opponents in his position. Lock and load. Look, you could use Zorko as your captaincy this week, but I have him here because I think he could be the highest scorer of the round. And like I've told you many times, I think you should VC the guy who you think is going to be the highest scorer in your team. Because I'd rather you use your VC here to ensure that you don't take a safe 1 to 25 and miss him. Like, if you VC Baz Smith and he gets 129, you're probably taking that, but you could be missing out on a 160 Zorko. So I would say if you own Zorko, save your VC for him. That's what I'll be doing. I own Baz and I could do that, but I'm going with Zorko. Now, point of difference. My point of difference captain is absolutely dominating this year. Round 1, we got a 136 from Noah Anderson. Round 2 was did not start, Baslenka. But then a 162 last week from Jack Sinclair. That's huge numbers. So let's keep it rolling with a gun midfielder against the worst midfield in the league. West Coast are the easiest matchup for inside midfielders, and it's by a huge margin. The gap between first and second is the same as the gap between second and seventh easiest. So they're by far the easiest matchup. Now, Tom Green walks into this matchup off a bye, then a difficult matchup with Hawthorn. Hawthorn are one of the hardest in the league. This is a guy who had 35 disposals in round 1 and still 31 disposals last week in that really tough Hawthorn matchup. So now, a matchup with the Eagles. This is the Eagles who have played 3 games this year, and they've already given up scores of 131 to Brayshaw, 133 to Neil, 132 to McCluggage, 137 to Rao, 136 to Anderson, and 128 to Tuke Miller. That's insanity over only 3 games. Remember when Tom Green also scored 137 against West Coast in the early rounds of last year? As an owner at that time, I definitely remember it. It was great. Tom's only owned by 1.4% of teams, which makes him a huge pod. But if any of those 1.4% are watching in this video, or if you own him in draft leagues, this is going to be a monster. So jump on board, captain or vice captain Tom Green. Now, captaincy options. So I've given you some high ceiling VCs. I'm going to give you now 4 safe captain options plus a 5th one that I think is actually a high ceiling. So these next 4, I think they're really good, but I don't think they're going to give you a 140. I think there's a lot of 120s coming this round. So, first up, Finn Callaghan. Callaghan started the year with that MVP 144 score in round 1, followed by a 104 and then a tagged 55 last week. The 55 was disappointing. He did start the game though, with 7 disposals in the first quarter, including a shot on goal that missed. So he did start the game really well, then the tag came. So then he was clamped by Finn McGuinness in a real Finn-on-Finn action. Finception? Finicide? Anyway, I digress. West Coast did not have Finn McGuinness or any other player named Finn. So as such, I expect Callaghan to run riot in this one as the number 2 midfield option behind Tom Green. I've already told you that I expect Tom Green to dominate this game, and I think Callaghan will be right there with him. Finn's a smooth-moving outside player that can also get contested possessions. He's kind of in a similar play style to guys like Andrew Brayshaw, Hugh McCluggage, Noah Anderson. Those 3 players have all gone 130 against the Eagles this year. So I don't think this is a giant 150 like I think Tom Green genuinely could be a 150. But I think this is a really safe 120 easily. And I really like this as a fallback captaincy if your VC doesn't work. This game's also played early enough though that you could VC Finn if you weren't that confident in captaining him, but against this Eagles matchup that is just the easiest in the league by a long way for midfielders, I would be pretty comfortable putting the captaincy on Finn Callaghan, even coming off a 55. Number 4, Lockie Whitfield, another player against West Coast. This is 3 Giants players in a row. Lachie Whitfield comes into this matchup with scores of 124, 110 and 105 in his last 3 meetings with the Eagles, and a 3-round average of 116. Now, something I need to address here, I have been probably incorrectly lumping West Coast and Richmond together. I've been assuming that they're both elite matchups for inside mids and for defenders. But looking into the data a bit more, Richmond give up insane points to defenders, while they're still positive to midfielders, but not to West Coast levels. And then inversely, West Coast are super leaky to midfielders. Well, they're still good for defenders, but they're not as profitable. They're just kind of solid, a little bit positive. So that's the reason for not having Whitfield as high as some others might expect. But there have been some great scores against defenders, by defenders against Eagles, such as Zorko's 136 in round 2. But outside of that, there's a lot of low tons from premiums or from players against the Eagles. So guys like Jordan Clark, Zach Guthrie, and then if I go back to late last year, guys like Nick Newman, they kind of all just low-tonned. Now, Whitfield is a bit more of a accumulator type than those guys, so I think he's going to get closer to Zorko's score than their flat 100. But I don't think this is going to be a big eye-watering captaincy like I think a lot of people are hoping. But it will save for 120, maybe pushing 130. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely on the cards here. And my number 3 captaincy option is Josh Dunkley. Josh makes my list for the 3rd week in a row, and for good reason. A season average of 132 and now a matchup with Richmond. Here we go. Now, a couple of things I need to note. First up, Camden McIntosh has been doing a little run with roll on opposing stars. He hasn't really been restrictive, as McRae and Cripps both did 120s against him still. But I think he's kind of just capping the Giants' ceiling, so he's keeping them around that 120 mark rather than letting them balloon off for like a 140. So I probably expect that attention to go to Lachie Neale this week. That's why I'm recommending Dunkley here over Neale. Neale should still dominate, and I think he's still a really good VC option if he doesn't get tagged. But I think Dunkley is much safer if you want a captaincy. And then the second thing is what I just talked about with Whitfield, but in reverse. Richmond are a positive matchup for inside midfielders, but they aren't as leaky as some of us think. It's more the defenders that destroy them. So that's why I have Zorko ahead of Dunkley and Neale in this one. Although I still think Dunkley and Neale should be very solid options. I think Dunkley and Neale are both worthy of VC and C considerations. But for example, this year, 4 midfielders have already gone over 120 against Richmond, but none of them have gone over 130. So there's 4 big scores, but they've all just been in that 120 to 130 range. So that's kind of where I think they're not as juicy as we think. They're still really good. And look, like a 130 that Rosie got, that's still a great captaincy score. But it's not probably the 140 or 150 that I genuinely think Zorko could do. Number 2, Luke Jackson. So I considered Luke Jackson as a captaincy option last week, and I told draft owners to go and captain him. But he didn't make my top 9, and that was a bit of a mistake, I'll admit that. I'm remedying that this week. Coming off scores of 91, 97, and then that monster 165 that he did against the Eagles. This week, he gets a matchup with Tim English, who he scored 115 on last year. Tim English, who is the 4th easiest matchup for opposing ruckman over the last 10 games. Tim English, who just gave up 133 to Tom De Koning, 112 to Darcy Cameron, that was despite Cameron Ruck sharing with Cox, and 122 to Tristan Cherry. So I've got Luke in this spot because, again, like the other 4 I've just talked about, I don't expect a massive score like he did last week, but I think if you need a safe 130 fallback in the last game of the round, I think this Luke Jackson captaincy option is looking like a really, really good safe one this week. But my number 1 captaincy option is Libba. Tom Liberatore, he's been flying under the radar and potentially getting disrespected in my captaincy videos. So I apologise to the great man with this inclusion. He's got a season average equal to Josh Dunkley and higher than Tom De Koning. And that's despite their hot starts and how much love they're getting. The Dockers are a positive matchup for inside midfielders over the last 10 games. Now, there aren't the big impressive scores against them to reel off like I often try and do, because they've only played 3 teams to start the year that don't really have giant ceiling midfielders. However, Chad Warner's 122 and Max Holmes' 125 should give us some confidence that they can be scored on. And for Libba, coming off 120, 142 and 133. And then his last 3 matchups against Freo as well, netting him scores of 128, 121 and 140. This is looking like too good of a matchup to pass up on. So if you own Libba, this captaincy in the last game of the round gives you the perfect opportunity to VC whoever you want. Take a punt on someone with a giant upside VC, knowing you've got this legend to back you up on Sunday Arvo. So they're my top 9 captain options for the week. But again, as requested, here's a bunch of names that didn't quite make the cut. I think they'll have good weeks. You probably could roll with them for Classic if you're really interested, but I'm saying they're not as good as these 9. But if you own them in drafts, definitely have a look at it. So I think Patrick Cripps, Tom De Koning should have solid games. I've already mentioned Max Holmes, but I'll definitely mention him again. He's a great option. Stephen May, I think against Geelong, they've been pretty leaky to defenders. Jordan Dawson, Mitch Hinge. I've talked about Neil Dunkley-Zorko. I think Tristan Cherry's a fair option. He doesn't have the best matchup, but he should bounce back, and there's a little injury concern, but I think Cherry will still be fine. Jesse Hogan is a really interesting one here against West Coast. This could be like an 8, 9, 10 goal game. I don't know if you'd necessarily trust a captaincy on a key forward in draft, but if you had to, Jesse Hogan, I think this actually could be a monster. Kieran Briggs as well. Coming back from his injury, did okay against Meek, but not that well. But this is the Eagles he's playing against, and as we saw, Luke Jackson just did 165 on them. I think Kieran Briggs could be a monster here. Kane Farrell, I think, has got a pretty nice matchup. He could score pretty well. And then rounding out the week, like Jordan Clark, you could look at the guys like Sarong and Brayshaw as well, but I actually think Jordan Clark with that defenders against Bulldogs matchup is pretty nice. And then Tim English himself, he's been a bit poor, but, Luke Jackson does give up a lot of points, so, Tim English could sneak to 100, that could be fine. So there we go. As you guessed from my video this week, I'm not really expecting many huge 140 plus scores this week. I think there's guys like Max Home, Finn Callahan, Lockie Whitfield, Josh Dunkley, Lockie Neal, Luke Jackson. They're probably all going to give us safe, 115 to 130s, which I think can be quite valuable. If you want to chase some upside, I'm going to be looking at either Bailey Smith, Max Gawn, Dane Zorko, or a Tom Green VC. I think any of those guys could go big. And look, if you've got Libba rounding out your week, I just love him as a fallback option, but a really high-scoring guy to bring you home in round 4. So that's my round 4 captaincy recommendations done. I'm going to be vice-captaining Dane Zorko this week. I do not believe I'll need a captaincy. I've already got the captaincy on Zach Reid because I think Zorko is going to be that big. But if Zorko does fail, look, I'm happy to roll the dice with a Finn Callahan captaincy or someone like that. But I just think this week's going to be peak Zorko piggery. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Turn your notifications on so you don't miss this video weekly. And good luck this week.